So for the last few decades, we've built this globally interconnected world. Everything was optimized for speed, for efficiency. But what happens when that web, that connection, is turned into a tripwire? The map on the wall hasn't changed, but the ink is bleeding. The global policeman didn't just retire, he burned down the precinct on his way out. We are now living in the era of the vacuum, and it seems like everything that binds us together is now being co-opted for strategic advantage.
And that vacuum isn't just one problem. That's the thing. It's many, many problems all crashing into each other at once. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking at a stack of sources today, everything from diplomatic cables to market intelligence, and they all define our current reality as a polycrisis. For you, the listener, a polycrisis is basically a simultaneous interdependent set of global crises. The failure of one system just amplifies the stress on all the others. It's fundamentally reshaping the global order in real time.
So our mission today is to cut through all of that complexity. We want to extract the four major pressure points that are converging globally. And they're all centered on one theme, the weaponization of interdependence. We're going to look at how trade deals, supply chains, domestic politics, even basic connectivity, how they're all strategic tools now. Okay, let's unpack this. And let's start where the heat is highest, the Middle East.
We have to start with Iran. We
Yeah.
just have to. Because the situation there has moved far, far past what you'd call standard localized protests. What began as demonstrations, rooted in economic distress after that massive currency collapse, it's accelerated. It's now what our sources assess is a de facto civil war.
And that's where the data just gets incredibly grim. The scale of the violence, estimates from multiple sources, we're talking Western intelligence, human rights organizations. They suggest the death toll is now somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people.
2 to 3,000. And to put that in perspective for you, that's drastically higher than the infamous 2019 Bloody November protests.
Yeah.
Or the 2022 Massa mini protests combined.
Combined, wow.
And the tactics are escalating. On both sides, we're seeing reports that the IRGC and the Bosque militia are using military-grade tactics.
So not just rubber bullets or water cannons anymore?
No. This is documented heavy machine gun fire aimed indiscriminately into crowds. And on the flip side, we have confirmation that the civilian resistance is becoming armed, especially in areas like Shiraz and the Kurdish regions. They're using firebombs, asymmetric resistance against security forces. The country is actively collapsing into street warfare.
And against this backdrop of just utter chaos, the U.S. policy under the Trump administration is, well, it's pretty clear. They seem to have completely abandoned the diplomatic path. They're pursuing what they call extreme pressure aimed directly at regime change. So how does that pressure actually manifest? What makes this different from previous sanction regimes?
This is what some are calling the economic nuclear option. It's a radical escalation. It's not just about secondary sanctions, which have always been complicated to enforce. This is the explicit threat of a 25% tariff on any country that continues to trade with Iran.
Any country. So China, India, Turkey.
All of them.
All of them. They're essentially forcing a binary choice. You either get access to the massive privileged U.S. market, or you maintain your ties with Tehran. You can't have both.
Okay, so how quickly did that ultimatum play out, especially among those countries that are always pledging allegiance to the anti-U.S. bloc? I'm thinking specifically about the BRICS alliance.
The fallout was immediate, and it was particularly stark for South Africa. What's fascinating here is the pressure they face because of ADOI, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, for you listening, ADOI grants preferential, usually duty-free, access to the U.S. market for certain African products. And South Africa's economy is heavily reliant on those benefits.
So they couldn't risk that 25% tariff. Exactly. Fearing that threat, Pretoria secretly pressured Iran to downgrade its participation in that planned Will for Peace 2026 naval exercise. They basically told them, please, just send observers, don't send warships.
And Iran, I'm guessing, desperate to show they weren't isolated, they ignored the request.
Ignored it completely. Sent the warships anyway.
Which just blew the doors open on the internal friction inside the BRICS alliance.
It forced it completely into the open, yes. It showed that for all the political rhetoric of, global South solidarity, the economic reality of losing access to the U.S. market is still the ultimate deterrent. The dollar still dictates geopolitics, even in alliances that were specifically designed to counter dollar dominance.
Okay, so we've seen interdependence co-opted in the Middle East. Let's pivot to East Asia, where kinetic threats have sort of been superseded by this very sophisticated economic warfare. China is using its position in the global supply chain not just for a trade advantage, but for for outright political coercion.
We saw the move recently. China implemented an export ban on certain dual-use items against Japan. And the trigger for this aggressive response, it was Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sane's recent public comments. She said that a Taiwan contingency could be classified as a survival crisis for Japan.
This isn't just a tit-for-tat trade spat, is it? This feels different.
No, it's not. This is economic coercion, and it's designed to be intentionally ambiguous. By issuing the ban, but not immediately clarifying the exact scope of the items, Beijing successfully spreads maximum fear throughout the entire Japanese industrial base.
So the goal isn't just to punish, it's to make Japanese companies so nervous that they start lobbying their own government.
Precisely. To get them to lobby Tokyo to walk back policy statements about Taiwan. It turns the private sector into a foreign policy tool for Beijing.
And the most potent weapon in their arsenal in this whole conflict, it's a microscopic component. It's rare earths.
Absolutely. The critical detail here is that even after years of trying to diversify, Japan still depends on China for about 60% of its total rare earth supply. If China bans heavy rare earth elements, specifically a metal called dysprosium, it would cause catastrophic damage.
And dysprosium is in, what, everything?
It's essential for high-performance magnets. Think EV motors, wind turbines, and crucially, defense equipment, missile guidance systems.
Yeah.
And China controls over 90% of the world's refining capacity for that material.
The pressure is enormous, but it seems like instead of capitulating, this threat actually forced a positive strategic countermove from Japan.
It did. The external threat pushed Japan to rapidly secure a strategic cooperation agreement on critical mineral supply chains with South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung. This is huge. A common economic threat from Beijing is actively overriding decades of historical friction between Tokyo and Seoul. It's reshaping the Asian security and economic architecture in a way that, frankly, U.S. diplomacy often failed to achieve.
We've seen interdependence weaponized overseas, but the ultimate vulnerability might lie in the anchor institution, the U.S. financial system itself. What happens when stability turns into political, what did you call it, lawfare?
Lawfare.
Yeah.
For those unfamiliar, it's using legal tools, using the judicial system for political ends. And the most jarring recent example is this direct, unprecedented conflict between the Department of Justice and the Federal Reserve Board. The DOJ has opened a criminal investigation, issued grand jury subpoenas to FRB Chair Jerome Powell over allegations about building renovation costs.
Building renovation costs. That sounds almost absurd on its face. An investigation over bad plumbing.
Wall Street analysts certainly don't see it that way. This is widely interpreted as a political maneuver. The aim is likely to pressure Powell into cutting interest rates ahead of the next FOMC meeting, to stimulate the economy before an election. The consequence is a direct challenge to the fundamental independence of the central bank. If that institution can be threatened over trivial charges just to influence policy, its credibility as an independent anchor is severely compromised. Globally.
And the markets, they signaled their distrust immediately.
They did. I mean, the S&P 500 and the Dow dropped, sure. But the true measure of distrust isn't stocks, it's the flight to hard assets. Gold hit a record high of $4,650 per ounce.
$4,650.
That number is significant. It's a classic signal of systemic fear. Investors are actively questioning the stability of the core financial system, the dollar itself, and they're seeking physical assets as a hedge.
Then we had the second populist policy shock targeting the financial system, President Trump's proposed cap on all credit card interest rates at 10%.
Right. And the current average rate is around 21%. So this is an immediate, huge threat to the profitability of the entire banking sector.
Yeah.
The opposition was fierce. You had CEOs of JP Morgan, Bank of America, all publicly voicing alarm.
I understand the banks would lose money, but it seems intuitively helpful for consumers struggling with debt. Is there any scenario where the banks are just overstating the risk, or is this credit crunch consequence pretty much unavoidable?
Well, the consensus among financial economists is that the credit crunch is a highly probable outcome. The bank's core argument is that a 10% cap wouldn't cover the high risk of default posed by higher-risk, lower-income borrowers. They claim they would be forced to just stop lending to that demographic entirely, which ironically triggers a massive credit crunch for the very people who need access to credit the most. The policy, while politically popular, would likely worsen inequality.
So it's a perfect example of how domestic regulation can become a political weapon, even if it has massive unintended consequences. Okay, let's move into the non-traditional frontiers, where this fragmentation is maybe most evident: cyber and space.
We have a new hybrid threat group. It's a merger of the skills of three notorious entities: Scattered Spider, Lapses, and Shiny Hunters. They're now known as the Scattered Lapses Hunters.
That sounds like a terrifying supergroup of malicious actors. How are they operating differently than a typical ransomware group?
Their core philosophy is what changes the game. Their slogan is, log in, not hack in.
Mm.
So instead of brute forcing their way through firewalls, they combine advanced malware with social engineering, psychological manipulation.
Things like vishing, voice phishing,
Hmm.
and those relentless MFA fatigue attacks.
Exactly. They do all that to steal legitimate employee credentials.
So it's less like breaking a window and more like stealing the supervisor's key card.
Precisely. They bypass traditional detection because the system just sees a valid user logging in from a known device. It doesn't see a hacker breaking in. And look at the impact. In the space sector, they penetrated the European Space Agency, ESA. They stole about 700 gigabytes of sensitive data that include confidential contracts, technical specifications involving partners like SpaceX, Airbus, and Thales, a direct blow.
And their reach extends deep into the soft underbelly of enterprise cloud infrastructure too, right?
Yes, the attack on the Salesforce ecosystem, they didn't hit Salesforce directly. They targeted third-party tools used by clients, like SalesLoft Drift. By exploiting OAuth tokens, you can think of those as digital keys granted by one service to another, they got access to the customer data of about 40 high-profile clients,
Including Google and Disney.
including Google and Disney. It's a supply chain failure, not in physical parts, but in the chain of trust we build in the cloud.
And continuing with space vulnerability, we also had the serious news about the emergency return of NASA's Crew 11 from the ISS.
The official reason was unpublicized medical concerns for one of the crew. NASA kept the details quiet, but the fact that a full return to Earth was required. That highlights the critical Achilles heel of long-duration space travel. Despite all our advances, the ISS simply does not have the capacity to handle advanced, serious medical crises.
That sounds like a really harsh lesson for the future, especially as we plan missions to Mars where a medical evacuation is, well, it's literally impossible.
It is a profound strategic concern. It raises an important question about whether our technology for exploration is really keeping pace with the fundamental biological risks of deep space.
And finally, let's cover the structural economic collapse happening back here on Earth, symbolized by SAC's global filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This feels like the final nail in the coffin for the luxury department store model.
It absolutely signals the definitive end of that model, but the immediate massive impact is on the brands themselves. The debt exposure reveals the enormous wholesale risk. Chanel is listed as the largest unsecured creditor. They're owed an estimated $137 million, followed by Kering, which is Gucci's parent company, at $60 million, and Richemont at $30 million.
That immense risk must be forcing a radical and very expensive shift in strategy for them.
It is. The entire luxury sector is accelerating its shift away from third-party retailers and toward direct-to-consumer models. The commercial real estate market will feel the pain from this for years as these anchor stores vanish. But for the luxury houses, this bankruptcy is a very, very costly wake-up call.
So we've covered a lot of ground. From armed resistance and tariffs fracturing bricks to cyber hunters stealing keys to the kingdom, Lawfare targeting the Fed, a $137 million retail collapse. It all just loops back to this idea that the global order is dissolving into an adjustment period.
That's right. To synthesize the macro trend, we are seeing the co-opting of everything. Tariffs are strategic leverage, rare earths are tools of coercion, domestic lawfare is a political tool. Even institutional independence is on the table. The consequence for companies and nations is simple. They must now prioritize redundancy and political reliability over sheer globalized efficiency.
And that prioritization has a direct, tangible cost for you, the consumer. Choosing political reliability over maximal efficiency, it inevitably leads to higher costs, to structural inflation.
Before we go, there is one last peripheral watch item that signals new friction within the West, even among allies. France announced it will open a consulate in Greenland on February 6th.
That seems minor on the surface. Why is that an indicator of a larger fracture?
Because it's an explicit countermove aimed at the U.S. The French foreign minister made statements implying that Greenland does not want to become U.S. property. It's a clear diplomatic jab at the historical Trump administration interest in buying the territory. This signals new NATO internal friction over the Arctic's resources.
So the world's risks are now less about tanks crossing borders and much more about tariffs, lawfare, and data breaches, the weaponization of our interconnected systems.
Which raises an important question. Given that the world's primary risks are now political, institutional, and economic rather than purely military, what is the weakest institution in your sphere of influence that could be weaponized next?
Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.